r/Nosleep. Posted by u/Jlagoodwin 1990. The emergency broadcast test did something to the people in my town. We've barricaded ourselves in the library. Part 1. If anyone ends up reading this, then it means I was successfully able to post it without it being taken down. Every other website and forum I've tried writing on has resulted in the same error notification being displayed, whether on a laptop or a smartphone. I can only assume it's something that the people in charge of, whatever this is, have done in order to prevent anyone left from getting word out about what's happened here, some kind of jamming device or scrambler. But, for whatever reason, this site still remains accessible, and so I'm posting this here, in a place that I don't think they'll ever check. Because someone needs to know the truth. I'm pretty sure everyone knows about the test of the emergency broadcast system that happened earlier today. It was all over the internet and on the news yesterday. According to the smiling anchorman on our local channel, it would happen around 12:20 in the afternoon, and last for about half an hour, broadcasting on television, radio, and to every cell phone turned on at that time. The town I live in, whose name I don't dare write in case anyone monitoring the internet is using a trolling program searching for specific names or phrases, only has a population of about 1,500 people. Because it's such a small and tight-knit community, conversations about the announcement began spreading like wildfire. Didn't they already do a test of the system less than 3 years ago? Old Mrs. Kravitz asked the cashier at the grocery store while I stood in line behind her with a frozen pizza in my hands. I think I read something about how they're required to perform the test every 3 or 4 years, Lorna, she replied as she patiently waited for the elderly woman to finish writing out a check for her purchases. Later that night, after my parents had gone to bed, as I gorged myself on the remaining slices of pizza and watched reruns of I Love Lucy, I got a text from my friend Aubrey. "If I have to hear about this stupid test one more time, I think I'll scream," it said. I let out a small chuckle and typed back, "Yeah, you'd think with all the commotion over town that we're about to end up in a 21st century version of the Cuban Missile Crisis or something." After a few minutes, my phone vibrated in reply. "Lol, no joke. I was gonna ask if you wanted to do some skateboarding tomorrow. We probably don't have much time left until the snow begins to fall." "Hell, yes," I muttered quietly to myself, then typed out a reply. "I am absolutely down for that. I'll meet you in the parking lot of the diner at around 11:45? I hit send, then a thought occurred to me. I sent a quick second text before she could respond. "I'm gonna turn my phone off tonight and leave it at home. I don't want to have to deal with that annoying tone going off." I took a sip of Coke and felt my eyes begin to droop. Sleep was calling my name. My phone buzzed. "Good idea, I'll do the same. Gonna hit the sack, catch you tomorrow." After bidding her good night as well, I held down the power button on the phone, the Samsung logo briefly showing before going to black. I reached for the remote and shut the TV off, dumping my dishes into the sink before heading upstairs. Tossing the powered-down phone onto my desk, I set my alarm clock for 10 before climbing into bed and quickly falling into a deep and dreamless sleep. In retrospect, turning off our phones and leaving them at home is probably what ended up saving our lives. At least, sparing us that horrible, initial fate, anyways. In the morning, I quickly told my parents where I was heading, and after promising them I'd be safe, I grabbed my skateboard, house keys and jacket and headed out the front door. The chilly fall air smacked me in the face as I let gravity pull me down the residential streets towards downtown. Behind me, the Rocky Mountains rose imposingly up into the sky, seeming like the turrets of a castle fortress. There's been a rumor going for close to 40+ years that horror writer Dean Koontz once visited here in the late 70s, and ended up basing the fictional town of Snowfield on it for his novel Phantoms. I think it's a load of bullshit, though I can't deny that our town looks very similar to what the book described, so who knows. Looking left and right to watch out for any cars or trucks, I entered the town proper and made a beeline for the diner. Aubrey was leaning against the steps which led to the front door. "You're 5 minutes late, you know," she said jokingly, checking the watch on her wrist. If I'd waited any longer, I would have had to organize a search party. I rolled my eyes at the lame joke and chuckled. "Bite me," I retorted good-naturedly, causing her to let out a laugh. "No thanks, I don't think I'd like the taste of you this time." A full-blown laugh burst out of me, which set her off more. After a few seconds, we got control of ourselves again and straightened up. "So, where do you want to go skate?" she asked me. I thought for a second, looking around. The diner was packed with patrons having either lunch or a late breakfast, and the parking lot full of cars and trucks. Too risky to shred here. An idea came to me, and I snapped my fingers. The old Blockbuster. It's got plenty of railings to grind, and we can kickflip over the parking lot bums. Plus, since it's in the back of town, Sheriff Wake likely won't find us and force us to move." Aubrey rolled her eyes at the mention of the sheriff. The man had a major stick up his ass and seemingly hated anyone skateboarding, or, as he called it, creating a nuisance. Aubrey shrugged. "Sure, why not?" Our plan set, we tucked our boards under our arms and walked through town towards the abandoned building which once housed the only video rental store in town. It took less than 5 minutes to reach it. The sign still stood at the entrance, the yellow letters long since having faded in the sun. I checked my own watch as Aubrey dropped her board to the ground and pushed off. 12:05. The test was supposed to start in about 15 minutes. I shook my head, again glad we decided to ditch our phones for the day. For a brief moment, I remembered I'd forgotten to tell my folks I'd done so, and a small swathe of guilt washed over me at the possibility they may end up worried if they tried to get a hold of me. But I pushed it out of my mind. I'd apologize when I got home. I dropped my own board to the ground and pushed off. For the next 10 to 12 minutes, the two of us whooped and laughed as we jumped and grinded our way across the parking lot. All the stress of having graduated and needing to pick a college to go to fell away from my mind, and I felt what I can only describe as peace. That peace was shattered by the sounds of tires screeching and steel and glass smashing against each other, reverberating off the buildings and seemingly off the mountains above us themselves. I'd been in the middle of grinding the entrance railing when it came, and it startled me so badly that I lost my balance, the board shooting out from under my feet as my hip smashed into the railing and I fell back to earth. I lay there for a moment, searing pain shooting through me before I felt a hand on my shoulder. "Damn, that was a nasty fall," Aubrey exclaimed. "Are you alright?" After deciding I hadn't broken any bones, I answered. "Yeah, I think so. It stings like a bitch," though I looked up at her. "What the hell was that sound?" I asked. She shook her head, a similar confused expression on her face. "I don't know, it sounded like it came from back towards the main road." She looked around, then back at me. "I think it was a car crash." "My thoughts, exactly," I muttered, pulling myself into a sitting position. Helping me to my feet, she motioned towards where the sound had come from. "You wanna go see?" she asked. After a moment's hesitation, I nodded. Tucking our boards back under our arms, we both hurried towards the road. Rounding the corner, we both immediately spied the devastation a few hundred feet ahead of us. "Holy shit," Aubrey breathed out. The intersection of Chestnut and Main Street looked like the aftermath of a destruction derby. Two cars had collided almost head-on with one another, what looked like a late 80s or early 90s Buick LeSabre, and a brand new Cadillac Escalade. With a sense of numbness surging through me, I realized I recognized both vehicles. The Cadillac belonged to Mr. Schultz, a rather wealthy but friendly man who rented out most of the houses he owned in town to the ski tourists that came to town every winter. The Buick belonged to Mrs. Kravitz, the old woman who I'd stood behind in the store yesterday. Smoke billowed out from both wrecks, and shattered glass and twists of metal littered the street around them for hundreds of feet. "Oh, my God," I said softly, echoing my friend's sentiments. We both exchanged a glance with each other, and then began running towards the accident. As we ran, a small part of the back of my mind noticed something which was small, but poignant. I don't see anyone else running out of the buildings. Everyone in town had to have heard it. Where are they? The train of thought was ripped away from me as we both skidded to a stop at the sight of the driver's door of the Cadillac being kicked open. An ear-piercing sound burst out of the SUV's interior, and I dropped my board and clapped my hands over my ears. From the corner of my eye, I saw Aubrey do the same, squeezing her eyes shut in pain and stumbling back into the side of the brick building next to us. Even through my hands, I could still hear the sound, though it was now slightly muffled. For a second, I couldn't place it, and then it hit me. It was the loud honking siren of the emergency alert system. But, it sounded wrong. It was as if the tones had been warped and distorted into something else, and by the sound of it, Mr. Schultz had been listening to his car radio at full volume when they'd gone off. Speaking of which, a figure stumbled out from the SUV, grabbing onto the open door for support. Holy hell, in a handbasket, Mr. Schultz survived that, I thought. I swung my gaze over to the Buick. Squinting through the spiderweb of cracks that had become the windshield, I saw a small hint of movement. Then, I saw Mrs. Kravitz lean back in her seat. She must have gashed her head open pretty badly, because her forehead was covered in blood. Keeping my hands over my ears to dull the still shrieking tone, I turned and got as close to Aubrey as I could so she could hear me through her hands and over the noise. "We've got to try and help them," I shouted as loud as I could. I could tell she understood me, as she nodded after a second. Then she looked back towards the wreck, and a look flashed across her face. A look I can still remember perfectly. First confusion, and then a clear expression of renewed horror. I felt a shiver shoot up my spine, and spun back around to look at what she'd seen. I truly wish I hadn't. Mr. Schultz was no longer next to his car. Instead, he'd ran around to the driver's side of the Buick. For a split second, I thought it was to help her. Until the screaming began. I didn't realize that an elderly woman could scream so high and shrill. The busted windshield prevented me from seeing exactly what Mr. Schultz was doing to Mrs. Kravitz. But it didn't prevent me from seeing the sudden fountain of blood which spurted out and coated the inside of the glass like paint. The sight shocked me so much that I took my hands away from my ears to clamp them over my mouth to keep from screaming. It was then that I noticed that the tone had stopped screeching, and silence had again settled over the town. But only for a few seconds. The sounds that sprang up, seemingly all over town, were almost somehow worse than the tone. They were the sounds of screaming. Yells and shrieks came from every conceivable direction, what I can only assume is what the depths of hell itself sound like. It was as if everyone in town were being brutally murdered at the exact same time. Almost as if it were a trigger, Mr. Schultz snapped his head up from where he'd been leaning into the car, and I saw that his eyes had gone completely red. It was as if all the capillaries in his eyes had burst. He reached back into the car and pulled something out. With a sickening churn of my stomach, I saw it was a sharp shard of broken glass, one edge dripping still fresh blood from it. Without even looking in our direction, he took off back towards the heart of downtown in a sprint, almost in the manner of a child rushing to join the frolicking and fun of his friends at an amusement park. For a few moments, neither one of us said anything, simply standing there in dumbstruck horror like deer in the headlights. Finally, Aubrey spoke up, her voice shaky. "What, the absolute fuck, just happened?" She managed out. I could only shake my head, the cries of terror and what almost sounded like rage still coming from around the corner. She spoke again. He killed her. Mrs. Kravitz. He butchered her like a cow in a slaughterhouse." "Eddie, what the fuck?" Her voice rose into a scream as she finished. I turned and clamped a hand over her mouth, afraid that her shriek would bring Mr. Schultz back to us. I put a finger to my lips, and after a second, she nodded. Pulling my hand away, she spoke softer. "Eddie, what the hell is happening?" I shook my head, finally managing to find my voice. I don't know." She looked back towards the main road. "We need to get back home." Now I nodded. "Agreed. But we can't blindly run out onto the main road." "Not with." I gestured towards the hellish sounds coming from the direction we needed to go. "Whatever the hell is happening going on." A look of realization crossed her face. "The alleyways," she exclaimed, causing me to remember the maze of alleys that crisscrossed between the main street buildings. "All right, but first, let's see what exactly the hell is going on." She hesitated, but nodded. Motioning to be quiet, I led the way to the corner of the building on one side of the intersection. "Just let me look around the corner quickly," I whispered. Again, she nodded silently. Taking a deep breath, I peered around the corner onto the main street. If I hadn't already been in shock, I don't think I would have been able to keep from screaming at the grisly sight that awaited me. It was like a scene out of a horror movie. People were dashing around from building to building clutching all sorts of things. Crutches, kitchen knives, there was even one man wielding what looked like an old sword which had hung inside the antique shop. That wasn't the horrifying sight. There were dozens of bodies littering Main Street. It seemed people had dashed out of everywhere, the diner, grocery and hardware store and more. Blood pooled around their still forms. Still others, some holding their arms or stomachs to stop the bleeding, were attempting to run away from those wielding weapons. They didn't make it very far though, as they were overwhelmed by the others. They all shouted and screamed in what sounded like a total and complete rage as they chased them down. "Fuck me," was all I could whisper out. I pulled my head back, and the look on my face must have told Aubrey all she needed to know. Her face had gone pale as a sheet. "That bad?" she asked. I just nodded. I could see the cogs turning in her head. "Okay, we stick to the plan. We use the alleys, get through downtown, and get back to our houses." I felt a wave of gratitude pass over me. She was managing to hold her composure better than I could have hoped for. I nodded, and following her, we slipped into the gloomy shade of the alley that ran behind the buildings on the right side of the street. We made our way carefully through them, making sure not to attract any attention from the hell still erupting on the main drag. But we saw little glimpses every time we reached a T-junction. We both saw people we'd known all our lives inflicting violence upon each other so shocking and vile, I can't bring myself to write it down. I would lose what little sanity remains in my head if I did. We made it to the back parking lot of the diner we'd initially met up in and stopped to wait. The sound of gunshots blasting out caused us both to freeze and duck back into the alley to hide. And not a moment too soon, either. Because we saw the sheriff's Ford Explorer fly down the road. Sheriff Wake was leaning out of the window, using one hand to steer while firing his pistol with the other. I only saw his face for a moment, but it was enough to see the same crazed look there as the others had. The sound of the roaring engine faded, along with the gunshots after a few seconds, but we could still hear the screeching tires echoing over all the other chaos. Aubrey turned to look at me, an almost hopeless look on her face. "Eddie, what the hell do we do?" she asked weakly. I knelt and thought, hard and fast. We can't stay outside much longer. We stay out here, we're dead. We need to find shelter, at least for a little while. I spoke. We need to find a place to lie low for a little while, until we know we can make it safely back to the other side of town. Her face turned into a mask of panic. But, what about our parents? I felt a knot tie itself in my stomach, the thought of my mom and dad caught up in this hell without a way to get a hold of me threatening to overwhelm me. But I kept as level a head as I could. We're not going to be able to help them if we both end up like the others, I said as calmly as possible. There's too many people all over the place to avoid all the way back. We need to find some place not many people would have been at, and hunker down until we think it's safe enough to keep going. She looked like she wanted to argue, but nodded after a few moments. Then she looked at me. "The library," she said simply. "Not many people besides the adults go there anymore. It's right on the other side of this building." She pointed at the brick apartments that made up the far side of the alley. I nodded. "Okay, let's wait a second, then go." She nodded, and after not seeing anyone for a minute, we began moving from car to car in the parking lot, using them as cover to reach the street. I looked towards the diner. The inside of the windows I could see were splashed in blood, evidence of the slaughter that must have taken place inside. I also noticed, with a vague air of surprise, that the ground in the diner's parking lot seemed to be littered with smartphones. The screens from many were still lit up, and as I stepped over one, I glanced down to see the notice flashing up at me. Test alert. This is a test of the National Wireless Emergency Alert System. No action is needed. As I read it, a sound snapped my head up. It was the sound of static from a radio, coming from a few cars up. Sharing a look of panic with Aubrey and convinced the sound would draw unwanted attention our way, we hurried down the line towards the sound. It was coming from a red Wrangler, one which I recognized belonged to Mr. and Mrs. Nolte, two survivalists who lived farther up in the mountains but came down into town to buy supplies and sometimes eat at the diner. Scrambling to the passenger door, I yanked on the handle, praying for it to be unlocked. The door mercifully opened, and with a last look around, I practically flew into the passenger seat. The crackling sound was coming from an old CB radio mounted under the dash, and I reached out to shut it off. That was when the crackling static changed to the smooth sound of a man's voice. "Sir, all entrance and exits to the town have been cordoned off and sentries placed to make sure no one enters or leaves. The satellite feed should be up in about 30 minutes, and the jammer will be up in 10. Another man's voice answered him, this one deep and authoritative. "Very good, Deacons. RF Ultra Phase 1 is now a go. Maintain radio silence for the next 12 hours." The first voice spoke again. "Roger that, sir, over and out." And with that, the radio died, now not even belting out static. I shot a look out the open door at Aubrey, who gave me a similar look of shock and confusion. Was this happening intentionally? Did someone cause this? I didn't stop to wonder beyond that, though. Climbing back out of the Jeep, I softly closed the door and motioned for her to keep moving. Making sure that nobody was near us, we stayed hunched over and made a mad dash for the library. That's where we've been ever since. We got inside and barricaded the front door with some benches which were inside the foyer. Aside from, to our horror, the body of Mrs. Thatch, the librarian, it was thankfully empty. I went and found an old drop cloth in a closet and draped it over her. I couldn't stand to see what someone had done to the back of her skull with what looked like a pipe or wrench. The sounds of our fellow townsfolk slaughtering each other barely let up for the last few hours, but as the sun began to set, it slowly turned silent. I don't know whether that's because the carnage has stopped for now, or everyone who hasn't gone insane is dead. I don't dare think about that, though. The idea that my parents, as well as Aubrey's, along with all our friends are either lying in a pool of blood somewhere, or slinking through the shadows looking for us is too much to bear. We still hear the roar of the sheriff's cruiser roaming around downtown, though. After some thought, and with night coming fast, we've decided to stay here for the night. In the morning, if it's safe, we'll take down our barricade and try and make it back to the residential side of town. In the meantime, I tried both the landline telephone, and the computers connected to the internet. Neither one of them worked. The only thing that did, which I'm using to type this now, is a laptop that seems to have a satellite connection. Whoever those people are, they must not have thought anyone in town had a satellite link up. It's still spotty, as I said at the start, though. No social media sites such as Facebook or Twitter load, and neither does YouTube. Email doesn't work. But, for whatever reason, Reddit seems to. And so, in the darkness of the library's break room, I type this out. I pray to God that it successfully posts, and that someone will see it. If you do, please, tell me what Aubrey and I should do. Anything that might help us survive. I'll check it in the morning, before we head out. If you have any idea what those men on the radio were talking about whatever RF Ultra is, please, tell me. Because I can't understand what is happening, or why. And, if they haven't blocked access entirely, I'll try and make another post tomorrow, to let you know we're still alive. For now, I need to try and get some sleep. If that's even possible. If I don't post, you'll know we didn't make it. The emergency broadcast test did something to the people in my town. We're still alive, for now. Part 2. Well, we're still alive, for now, anyways. It still seems as though my small porthole to the outside world hasn't been discovered yet, and happily, the satellite connection this laptop has seems to be usable anywhere in town. The fact that people were able to see it is a blessing in itself. First off, I just want to thank everyone who tried to give Aubrey and me advice. We took a good amount of the things you suggested to heart, and in a few cases, it actually ended up saving our lives. While we couldn't move Mrs. Thatcher's body outside last night, and though I don't think I'm dealing with something that'll bring the dead back to life, I did pull her into a storage closet and lock the door from the outside, just to be safe. I didn't dare ask Aubrey to help. She looked as though she was going to throw up just at the sight of me dragging her away. I also grabbed a set of keys off the desk, and I'm keeping them to use the library as a fallback shelter if we need to. The idea that our own government could be responsible for this, though, it's almost too much for my mind to comprehend. How, in this day and age, could they get away with something like this? Wiping an entire town, small or not, off the map? I mean, I've heard about MKUltra from my father, who used to teach history at the local high school, and it seems to make sense that since the man on the radio called this RF Ultra, it might be related. But, that was in the 1950s and 60s, over half a century ago. I don't know. I just can't think about that right now. Anyways, I should tell you what happened today. I didn't really get much sleep last night. Every couple of hours, I'd hear what sounded like scratching on the front door of the library, and I'd lay on one of the break room's couches, my eyes wide open and staring at the ceiling, praying that whoever it was, they wouldn't find a way in. I heard 2 more people scream as well. It means that there are some sane people left in hiding. Though, how many more of them are left, I don't know. I woke Aubrey up as the sun began to rise over the town. For a moment, a peaceful look crossed her face as she looked up at me. Then, it was wiped away as she fully woke up, remembering where we were and the hellish situation we were in. She sighed and put her head in her hands. I hope to God that it was nothing more than a nightmare I had, she said softly. I sat down beside her, pulling her into my arms and giving her a hug. I wish that it was, too, I confessed. After we were both fully awake, we checked the library for food and supplies. In the gathering dark last night, we hadn't been able to scout out much, but, thankfully, there were a couple of vending machines in the entrance hall of the library. One of the keys on the ring unlocked them, and we were able to pull out some bottles of water and candy bars for breakfast. As we ate and the sun rose higher in the sky, we spoke about what to do. I gently broached the subject, as one of you had suggested, of us simply hiding out in the library for a few days to be safe. But she immediately shot it down. Eddie, I am not leaving my parents out there. She cut herself off, looking down at the ground before finishing. I need to know if they're okay or not, I sighed. As much as I knew it may be foolish, I, too, wanted to know if my parents were alive, dead or, worse. Okay, we'll go look. But, we are not splitting up. We'll go check your house first, and after, we'll head uphill to mine. I looked around. We can't go out there unarmed, though. We need something to defend ourselves. After a few minutes searching, we found a paper cutter in a back office, which, after unscrewing a bolt, gave us a very formidable weapon. Aubrey also found a silver letter opener, which she slid into the front pocket of her jeans. Now armed, and sliding the laptop I used into a carrying case and slinging it over my shoulder, the two of us moved to the barricaded front door and, as quietly as we could, pulled the benches away. I checked my watch. The time read just after 11. Almost 24 hours had passed since this entire insanity began. And yet, it felt more like an eternity. "You ready?" I whispered. Aubrey nodded, and with a final deep breath, she reached up and slowly turned the brass doorknob. The sun streamed through the open doorway, blinding us for a moment. I blinked my eyes rapidly to get them to adjust. Aside from an overturned trash can across the street, it was not only deserted, but could easily have passed for any normal day. But that was a deadly deceptive appearance. Moving quickly, we stepped out onto the steps and locked the library doors behind us. Sliding the keys into my jacket pocket, I motioned for her to stay low and pointed across the street to where the alley continued. We'd have to traverse another 2 or 3 blocks before the road began to slope back up to the houses, condominiums, and at the very top, the bottom of the ski lifts. Sure that nobody was near us, we dashed for the alley. Slipping into the darkened shadows, we caught our breath for a second. Well, we've made it 50 feet out of the building without being swarmed or even spotted yet. I half hoped that the affected, which is what I'd begun to think of them as in order to try and mentally detach myself in order to not break down, had ended up turning on each other when no more victims were easily reachable. Keeping that hope in my mind, I led the way through the first alley. As we reached a T-junction, something dripped onto the back of my neck. Reaching my hand back, I pulled away to see my fingers had turned crimson. I froze, then swallowed hard and looked up. The building the alley ran between had the hardware store and flower shop to our left, and a storage warehouse on the right. We stood underneath stairs for the fire escape, which went up to a 3rd-story window, where someone lay halfway out of it, face down on the metal landing. Good God! I couldn't tell who it was, they were too high above me. But I knew they were dead. I could see their eyes, staring wide open but unseeing through the grating. "Aubrey, whatever you do, do not look up," I whispered. In any other situation, she would have given me some smart-ass remark about how she hadn't planned to in the first place. But she didn't. She just stared straight ahead and nodded. We continued on until we reached the end of the alley, where we'd need to cross another street to reach the next. The sound of smashing glass and clanging came from around the corner. My heart stopped, and my throat went dry as cotton. Shit. The sound of footsteps rapidly approached the alleyway, and I realized there were too many for us to take on, even armed. I felt Aubrey tug at my shoulder and turned to see her motioning to the space underneath a dumpster next to us. "Under there, hide," she hissed. I didn't dare hesitate. I dropped to my hands and knees and slid into the narrow and disgusting space, making sure to pull the paper cutter blade under with me. Aubrey rolled under and scooted next to me. Not a moment too soon, either. We couldn't see any more of them than their feet and legs from where we were. But I counted at least 10 or 15 of them, all walking in a group. They didn't speak a word to each other, though a few seemed to mumble incoherently from time to time. They passed by our hiding spot, thankfully not seeming to have taken any notice of us. One thing made me feel like I was going to vomit, however. One of them had been dragging something behind them. Or, I should say someone. Someone I knew. It was Jeff Bailey, one of the star running backs for the high school football team. His arms skittered along the ground behind him, his class ring pinging off the asphalt from time to time. An arrow stuck out from this head. Someone had shot him with a bow. I felt a small tremor beside me and turned my head to see Aubrey silently crying at the sight. Jeff had been a decent guy. We waited for a few minutes to make sure they wouldn't come back, as well as Aubrey to compose herself, then scooted out from our hiding spot. Brushing off the dirt and debris stuck to my jacket and pants, I cautiously approached the alley entrance. I didn't see hide or hair of the passing group. They must have turned onto the main road. I jerked my head to signal Aubrey to follow me. Together, we silently ran across the street. There was only a single block left before the houses began. We made our way past the back entrances to the bakery and post office. That was when I froze, seeing the symbol on the half-opened back door to my right. The sheriff's department. I knew we needed to keep moving. Waiting too long out in the open, even in the alley, was a chance we could be spotted. But, the idea of being able to get a gun was appealing. After all, the blade and letter opener may help us against 1 or 2 of the affected, but if we were spotted by a group like the one we saw a minute ago, we were screwed and tattooed. My decision was made. Motioning for Aubrey to come over, I slowly pulled the half-open door back, looking inside. The back room was covered in shadows, making it hard to see anything. "Eddie, what are you doing?" I heard Aubrey whisper behind me. I put a finger to my lips, and she mercifully fell silent again. There didn't appear to be anyone in the room. Beckoning to her, I slid inside. After a hesitant moment, she followed. We found ourselves inside the records room. Tall filing cabinets rose up on either side of us, leading to a single door on the left which led out to the main office. At the other end of the room was a door. The white lettering read Armory. Keep locked at all times. Moving quickly towards it, I tried the handle. It wouldn't budge at all. I swore under my breath. Great. And I'm pretty damn sure I know who has the keys, too. Heading back the other way, I reached for the handle of the door to the office. This one turned, and I slowly opened it. A single flickering fluorescent bulb lit overhead. Ahead, though, I could see sunlight streaming through another open door. The two of us moved through the dimly lit room, which I could see housed the two jail cells that, mercifully, appeared to be empty, and approached the open door. Taking a deep breath, I stuck just the top of my head around the corner. A pair of eyes almost level with mine nearly caused my heart to stop. I scrambled back in a panic, falling over my own legs and onto the carpeted floor. Aubrey looked terrified. What? She hissed. Not answering her, I flew back to my feet, picking up the paper cutter arm and raising it over my head. I was sure the affected those eyes belonged to would rush into the room at any moment. The tension in the air was so thick, you could have cut it with a knife. But nobody appeared in the doorway. After a few minutes, I lowered the blade and again moved towards the door, this time with Aubrey literally peering over my shoulder. Together, we looked around the door frame. Fucking hell. She moaned out weakly as we spied who the eyes had belonged to, and turned away, sounding like she was about to throw up the candy and water we'd had earlier. It was the sheriff's deputy, Deputy Thorne. Unlike Sheriff Wake, he hadn't been a giant pain in the ass, and seemed to try and cut the kids and teenagers in town a break whenever they would get into trouble. It had been thanks to him that I avoided juvie a few years ago when I'd been caught graffitiing the back of the high school as part of a dare. I'd actually liked him. Unfortunately, it looked as though he'd been the first victim of the sheriff. His eyes were wide and glassy, his mouth wrenched open in a silent scream of horror as he sat slouched in the swivel chair behind his desk. What looked like a large hunting knife stuck out of his stomach, and it looked as though he'd been stabbed a hell of a lot. I swallowed, closing my eyes and still seeing the horrible image imprinted on the back of my eyelids. Forcing them open again, I whispered a silent prayer for the men, then looked closer. My eyes drifted down to the deputy's service belt, hoping and wishing I'd find what I softly exclaimed to myself. The deputy's pistol still sat in its holster. Taking a deep breath, I gently sat the paper cutter blade down and moved over to him. I reached out, overcome with a sudden irrational fear that the very dead man would snap to life and reach out to grab my arm. But he happily never moved. Unbuttoning the holster, I slid the pistol out and checked it. It was still fully loaded. I checked the extra pockets of the belt and came up with 2 extra magazines for the gun. Now we have a much better chance of surviving this. At least for a little while longer. The sound of tires screeching snapped me out of my thoughts. It had come from outside the front of the station, beyond the double glass doors. A hand fell across my shoulder, and I nearly had a second heart attack, spinning around to see Aubrey's panicked face inches from mine. We need to go, right now. I didn't argue. Tucking the pistol into the waistband of my jeans and picking up the blade, I followed her rapidly back through the cell room and into the filing room. Behind us, I heard the sound of screeching tires again, followed by the sound of a car door opening and slamming shut. Fuck, it's the sheriff. I quickly closed the door to the filing room shut, then fled out into the alley behind Aubrey, pulling that door shut as well. With it securely closed, we crouched down behind some garbage cans and waited. There was silence for a time, and then the pounding sound of footsteps came from behind the closed door. Keys jangled, and the sound of a door being unlocked could be heard. Oh, hell, I know where he's going, I thought. But this was also our chance to make a break for it. Come on, we need to go while we can, I whispered to her, then moved as quickly and quietly as I could towards the final alley entrance. Beyond it, I could see the first row of houses that signaled the change from downtown to the residential district. Stopping at the corner, I risked a glance around. To the right, I could see the Sheriff's Explorer parked haphazardly in front of the station. The driver's door hung wide open, and the motor still rumbled quietly in the still air. To the left, the street appeared to be deserted. I saw the body of a middle-aged woman I couldn't recognize lying in the middle of the street, bags of spilled groceries sprawled on the ground around her. The way ahead to the first house was clear. Okay, we're gonna run across the street to that first house there, I said, pointing at the single-story ranch house. Aubrey squinted. You mean the Damones? She asked. I looked again, spying the name on the mailbox. Yeah, the Damones. We're going to try and stick to the backyards and sides of the houses, using them as cover. Your house is only another 2.5 blocks away. We don't stop for anything, we just head straight there. Sound like a plan? She looked at me, biting her lip before nodding. Yeah, a plan, she said simply. I could tell she was thinking about her parents. Mr. and Mrs. Carmody were both decent, hard-working people who I liked as much as I liked Aubrey. I hoped that, somehow, they were still alive. But this wasn't the time to think about that. Okay, on the count of 3, we make a break for it, I said. I held up 3 fingers, then slowly lowered them one by one. The second that the last finger dropped, the two of us began sprinting across the last slab of black pavement that separated us from the sanctuary of the houses. That was when someone else came sprinting around a corner to our right. My eye was drawn to the sudden explosion of movement, and I caught a glimpse of a disheveled man running towards us. For a split second, my heart stopped, and my free hand reached back for the pistol in my waistband, fearing he was one of them. But then I saw the terrified expression plastered on his face and realized he was normal. Like us. I also recognized him. His name was Maurice, and he'd been the town drunk for as long as I'd been alive. He was clearly sober now, though, and I saw his eyes lock on mine. I'd begun to raise my fingers to my lips to motion him to be quiet, when he began shouting at us. "Help me, please, you two, help me!" he screamed. I could see blood trailing behind him from a wound in his shoulder. The sound of his voice was like a baseball through a plate glass window in how it shattered the tension-filled silence, echoing off of everything. Fuck, every one of the affected are going to hear him. I spun around to Aubrey. "Run for the Damone's house," I exclaimed. We turned and sprinted for the steps leading up to the front lawn as fast as our legs could carry us. Taking them 2 at a time, I heard Maurice scream out again behind us. "Wait. Please, don't go. Help me." My heart wrenched in my chest at the man's pleading. I wanted so desperately to turn around and motion for him to follow us. But I knew that his voice would be attracting the attention of everyone we didn't want this way. And so, I yanked on Aubrey's arm, practically tearing her up the last few steps. Staying outside was no longer an option, we needed a place to get out of sight. I spied an open front window which led to the Damone's kitchen. The white curtains slowly billowed outside in the breeze. "Inside!" I ordered, and still hearing Maurice cry out behind us, I powered my way to the window. I turned and almost flung Aubrey through it, then hauled myself in after her. Reaching up, I pulled the window almost completely shut, but not quite. Just enough to still hear what was happening. Maurice was crying for us to come back outside and save him. Then it suddenly cut off. Feeling a knot tie itself in my stomach, I moved back to the window, setting down the blade and pulling the pistol from my waistband. Flicking off the safety, I held it in one sweaty hand and peered over the edge of the window. Maurice had stopped just before the bottom of the steps leading up to our hiding spot. He had turned around, facing back towards the other side of the street. Where the sheriff now stood, half in and half out of the open door of the sheriff's office. In his hands was a long, black shape. I quickly recognized it as the department's sole AR-15 rifle. My heart fluttered in my chest. Against that, the pistol in my hands was practically a damn pea shooter. For a few moments, the scene in the street stayed frozen, as if someone had hit pause on a movie. Then I saw the crazed look on the sheriff's face intensify, his lips curling back into a snarl. Maurice let out a shrill scream and turned, beginning to run down the street towards the opposite end. For a man who drank himself into a blackout every night, he was fast. But not nearly fast enough. I saw the sheriff move quickly to the hood of his cruiser. Using the hood as a stabilizer, he aimed the rifle at the retreating man's back. Not even a second later, the stabbing sound of a gunshot rang out. I heard Maurice let out a yelp and swung my gaze back to him. He'd fallen to the ground, clutching at his left leg. A small pool of blood was forming around him. I realized with a dull sense of horror that the sheriff had intentionally aimed for a wounding shot, instead of a killing one. The reason why became clear a moment later. I heard the sound of a car door slam shut, and swung my gaze back to see the cruiser fly backwards, turning to face the man. A moment later, the lights and sirens sprang to life, and I saw a look of horror flow over Maurice's face as he realized what was about to happen. I know I had a similar look on my own face. The tires squealed, and the cruiser leapt forward, accelerating rapidly. I saw it close the distance to Maurice, heard him scream out. But I turned away before I could see the impact. I heard it though, the dull thunk could be heard even over the blare of the siren. I gritted my teeth, then spared a look out the window again. I truly wish I hadn't. The cruiser was reversing back over the now crumpled form of the man. I looked away again, focusing on the other end of the block. There was a group of affected rounding the corner, sprinting towards the carnage unfolding opposite them. I counted at least 20 or 30. Realizing this was a chance to study them, to see if I could figure out anything by watching them, I stayed crouched by the windowsill. I heard Aubrey whisper something behind me, but I was too focused to hear. The group appeared to be all age ranges. I saw full-grown adults as well as teenagers, and even one or two elderly folks who dragged their walking sticks behind them. What churned my stomach, however, was seeing the kids. There were what looked like 3 or 4 of them as young as 12, sprinting among the group and holding things like knitting needles and knives. Good fucking lord. Aubrey's hand fell on my shoulder, and she spoke again. Now, I did focus on what she said. "What?" I whispered to her. Her eyes were sad and full of sympathy, something I didn't understand. "Eddie, turn away, please. Don't look," she said gently. I saw the look in her eyes again, and I suddenly felt as though a claw had clenched itself around my heart. She'd seen something in the group I hadn't. She'd seen. No. Oh, God, please no. I turned, hearing her tell me again not to look. But I didn't listen to her. I couldn't. I gazed back out the window at the now passing mob. They were close enough that I could see people I knew now. Michael, from our graduating class. Kelly, who I'd had a crush on since freshman year of high school. Mr. Olivier, the kindly Italian man who ran the deli and gave us free sandwiches. So many others. And, almost in the middle of the pack, stood someone I knew all too well. A tall woman, her platinum blonde hair now dirty and streaked with blood. The entire front of her was streaked with blood, all of which was certainly not hers. Behind the blood-filled eyes, I could barely see the small spots of blue which remained. The lips which had once kissed me goodnight as a child now pulled back in an insane sneer. In her right hand was my father's hunting knife, its blade looked almost rusted by the amount of blood covering it. My breath came in short, ragged gasps as tears threatened to pour out of my eyes. Mom?" The pack of affected, my mother among them, sprinted past the house we hid in, flowing around the sheriff's cruiser like a stream around a rock before stopping. Realizing there was nothing for them to attack, they turned and hurried away, looking for more targets. A moment later, the cruiser peeled out, also disappearing and leaving Maurice's crumpled and shattered body lying in the road. I turned away, sliding down onto the vinyl kitchen floor. Tears now flowed freely from my eyes, and I felt my heart shatter inside of my chest. I stayed as quiet as I could, knowing sobbing could bring the horde back our way. But, I couldn't stop crying. I felt Aubrey slide down beside me and put her arms around me. For a moment, I attempted to pull away, then folded into her. We huddled like that for a long while. Finally, she pulled back and wiped some of the tears from my eyes. "I'm sorry, Eddie," she said softly. I used the sleeve of my jacket to wipe the rest away, trying to get control over myself. "I'm so sorry," I breathed in deep, letting out a choked breath as images of my mother murdering my father in an insane rage refused to stop replaying in my mind. But I knew I couldn't grieve long. We had to keep moving. I simply nodded at her, finding my voice and praying it sounded as stable as I imagined it. "The only thing that matters now, is making it to your house and finding your parents," she nodded, then stood up and held out her hand to me. I reached out and took it, allowing her to pull me to my feet. I tucked the pistol back into my waistband, then picked up the paper cutter blade. "Let's go," then I said. Together, we moved quietly through the Demones. Thankfully, it seemed they'd been out of the house when everything had gone down, because it was empty. Opening the back door, we slid out into the backyard. Keeping as low of a profile as we could, we began to move from house to house, heading in the direction of Aubrey's. As we darted from street to street, we passed by more bodies, showing that this side of town hadn't been saved from the slaughter. But the numbness settling in me overseeing my mother as an affected made me not really care. Even when we passed by a man who'd been run over by his own lawnmower, I simply stared for a moment. Eventually, we made it to Aubrey's house. That's where we are now, as I typed this out. When we arrived, we saw that her parents' Chevy Tahoe was not in the driveway. Aubrey said something about how they'd said they needed to go out of town sometime yesterday, but that she didn't know when they left, or if they'd come back before everything had happened. I can tell she's hoping that they're still out of town, unable to get back in. It'd be a better fate than others have. Though I honestly don't know what the people blocking off the roads into town would do to people from here trying to get back in. We've decided to stay here for the night, with dark coming on fast. It's too dangerous to return to the library, and thankfully, due to Mr. and Mrs. Carmody being, well, shall we say very affluent, they'd built the inside of their house almost like a fortress. All the doors had steel deadbolts, which we all locked, as well as shatterproof glass. We closed all of the curtains, then gathered some food, water and 2 sleeping bags from the Carmody's camping closet and moved into the basement, locking the door behind us. Down here, we found an old ham radio set that Mr. Carmody has as a hobby. Remembering the advice one of you gave me, I turned it on softly, but heard only dead air. I've left it on for now, just in case. I'm using this time as I type this out to charge the laptop. The carrying case had a charging cord in it. I've noticed that even less web pages seem to work now without moving to an error page. One thing I did find has me worried, if not downright afraid. A few search engines, such as Bing, still seem to work, and when I randomly decided to type in my town's name, nothing came up. No search results at all, except for ones asking if I'd meant somewhere else. That's impossible. This place even used to have its own Wikipedia article, however small. But now, it's all gone. It's as if all trace of it is being erased from the internet. Is that even possible to do, to wipe an entire town from existence, no matter how small? The radio just crackled a moment ago. I heard that same voice speak over it. Sir, RF Ultra Phase 1 is completed. We've managed to calculate a 78.5% success rate in subjects from the satellite data we've received. Over the deep voice answered him. Roger that, Deacons. Phase 1 complete. Phase 2 will commence tomorrow at 1400 hours. The project will last no longer than 59 hours longer, is that clear? The first voice answered. Roger that, sir. When can we expect our in-house scientists to arrive for analysis gathering and briefing? You'll be receiving them tomorrow at 0800 hours, Sergeant. Until then, continue monitoring all exits, as well as all radio channels. If anyone approaches, affected or not, you are authorized to use lethal force. Over and out. And with that, the radio died again. I can barely begin to make sense of this. I still feel numb from, I can't bring myself to say it again. What I saw. This is so beyond fucked up that it's not funny. We're toys, specimens in some government or group's fucking science experiment. People I knew and loved are dead, just because someone wanted to test some likely highly illegal shit out. Just, what the hell, dude? And what the hell are they even making a fucked up weapon like this for, anyways? What sadistic purpose could something like this possibly have? I don't know. I feel exhausted, mentally and emotionally. I've just been staring at the huge map of town thumbtacked to a board behind the radio for the last half an hour. There are 3 ways out of town. The main road leading in and out. A dirt access road which leads off to the east that's only used by the power company and off-roaders. And the ski lifts and trails that lead up into the mountains. There's a mark, though, halfway up. It looks like an old mine shaft buried in the side of the mountain. Maybe there's something I can use there, but for now, I can't think anymore. I need to try and sleep. Even though I know I'll suffer nightmares after what I've seen today, I need the rest. I can hear Aubrey shifting in her sleeping bag, already asleep. You guys helped us today. You guys helped us stay alive with the things you said. Please, if you can think of anything more, any advice or information, please tell me. Because right now, Aubrey and I really need it. I'll check it in the morning, and hopefully update you tomorrow about what happens. We need to try and find a way out of here. Before we end up like Maurice and the others. The emergency broadcast test did something to the people in my town. We're getting ready to try and escape. Part 3. This will be the final post that I will make from town. In fact, it likely will be the final thing that's ever posted or transmitted from this town. They're getting ready to wipe it completely off the face of the earth. I don't exactly know how, but, after today, I don't know what to believe. And that's saying something after the last 2 days in this hellhole. So much has happened today, so many things that have left Aubrey and I both confused, torn apart, and for me at least, angry. But I'll get to that in a second. First off, thank you again to the people who gave us as much advice as they could. It was, again, invaluable, to say the least. When today started, especially after, well, we'll get to that, I felt almost completely hopeless. But the things you guys instructed us to do stayed stuck in the back of our minds, and we're poised to try and escape soon. As soon as the sun fully goes down. But until that moment, I'll tell you about what happened today. When the alarm on the wind-up clock we brought downstairs went off, and we both woke up, the first thing we did was check my post to see what was said. Looking at the comments, we grabbed a pad of paper lying on the desk next to the ham radio and began writing out a list of things we might need. Aubrey said that, since her parents were avid campers, a lot of the survival gear and camping equipment was stored in their garage. Sure enough, when we checked, we found heavy-duty sleeping bags, flashlights, iodine tablets for purifying water, as well as 3 parkas for winter hiking and boots. We took all of it and moved it into the dining room near the back door, packing as much as we could into 2 camping backpacks we found. We also took the large map of town off the wall downstairs and folded it away, just in case we needed it. With the sun rising high in the sky, we then braved the roaming gangs of affected to make a mad dash back to the library to see if, like one of you suggested, there might be a map of the sewers or mine shaft that we could use. We didn't see the sheriff on our trek down and back, but we still could occasionally hear the siren of his cruiser a few blocks away, along with a few gunshots. Thankfully, I also didn't see the horde that my mother, or what used to be my mother, was a part of. When we got to the library, we found that leaving had been a smart choice. The large wooden double doors had been broken in, and the inside turned upside down. Books and computer parts like strewn about everywhere, and all the windows had been busted out. Going back to the records room, we began opening and closing drawers, searching for anything that could help. After a few minutes, I heard Aubrey let out a small laugh of relief. "Eddie, look at this," she exclaimed, then spread the large, rolled-up paper out onto a half-destroyed table. It was an old survey map, the date in the upper right-hand corner from the early 60s. Bearing the name and crest of the old mining company which had once provided our town with much of its employment, it showed the layout of the mine in almost intimate detail. I focused on it, trailing my finger along the maze of quarters that made it up. "Hot damn," I said, smiling for the first time in days. "Aubrey, look. The mine goes all the way back to the other side of the mountain face. If we can get up to the entrance on our side without being spotted, we could use it to get to the other side and down to the next town." She looked at what I had seen, then began to play with her hair, a sign of her nervously thinking. "But, what if there's a collapse in one of the tunnels? It's been abandoned for at least 50 years. We don't know the conditions inside." I felt a small wave of uncertainty wash over me, then focused again. "We don't have any other choice, Aubrey. The sewers will likely be guarded, and the 2 roads out are blocked. This is our best chance to get out." After a moment of nervous thinking, she nodded. "Okay. You're right. But we'll have to be careful. They likely have someone patrolling up near the top of the mountain, if not a helicopter or plane. Plus, we need to keep from being seen by." She pointed up towards the ceiling. "By the satellites over us." I nodded. "We'll figure that out when we get back to your house," I responded, folding up the map and shoving it into my pocket. With our plan set, we made one final stop downtown. As risky as it was, something you guys suggested stuck in my head. So we made our way back to the diner's parking lot. Making sure to stay hidden, we made our way to the Knowles Jeep. I wanted to check and see if they had kept a set of spare keys inside, so we could stop by their home on the way up the mountain and see if there would be anything useful to take. I searched everywhere, not finding anything in the glove box or the center console. "Damn it," I whispered. "Aubrey, there's nothing in here." There was no answer behind me. "Aubrey?" Still nothing. Fear suddenly fell over me as though someone had poured a bucket of ice water onto my head. Jumping out of the Jeep, I moved quickly to the back of the truck. As I came around the corner, I saw a flash of movement approaching me. Oh, fuck. I didn't even have a chance to reach for the gun or raise the blade. A large, meaty hand wrapped itself around my throat, and I felt myself being lifted off my feet. The metal and rubber of the Jeep's spare tire slammed into my back, and my vision blurred for a moment. A cry of fear and panic rang out. "Aubrey." Blinking my eyes rapidly, I focused on my attacker. Mr. Nolte snarled into my face, a large cut adorning one cheek where someone had cut him trying to defend themselves. My eyes flashed down to see what he held in his other hand. It was the sword I'd seen another man wielding that first day this had all began. Evidently, it had either been dropped and recovered, or Mr. Nolte had killed him for it. I saw him pull the arm holding it back, and I understood in one horrific realization that the man intended to run me through with it, pinning me to the back of the Jeep. I instinctively kicked out, aiming my left foot for the man's wrist and praying for my aim to be true. The first kick missed by inches, and I feared I wouldn't have time for a second. But it seemed that the insane man was relishing the moments before the kill. Like I'm a deer he's about to take out. The thought made me kick out again with all my strength. Yes. My aim was dead on this time, as my foot connected with his wrist. I heard him let out a small grunt of pain as the sword fell from his grasp and clattered to the ground. Black spots began to appear in my vision from the lack of oxygen. As he turned to look to see where his weapon had fallen, I fumbled into my waistband for the pistol. My fingers slid on the rubber grips, then caught as I yanked it out. Mr. Nolte was turning back to see what I was doing as I aimed the gun toward him as best as I could. I saw his eyes lock onto the weapon pointing almost point blank at him. His arm began to reach out to grab it. I fired, pulling the trigger as hard as I could. Growing up in a relatively small, rural town, my parents had introduced me to guns at an early age. I had been taught firearm safety, and when I'd been old enough, Mom and Dad had taken me to the range for lessons. I had always been a decent shot, the instructor had been impressed. But I had never pointed a gun at another human being before. They always tell you, never aim a gun at anything or anyone you don't intend to shoot. I had seen crime shows about homicides before, seen fictionalized versions of shootings watching shows like The Sopranos and Ozark, but nothing can prepare you for the real thing. Nothing can prepare you for actually shooting another person, affected or not. The sound of the shot filled my ears with what sounded like bells being rung directly next to my head, and the acrid smell of smoke reached my nostrils. I felt the grip on my throat loosen, and I fell back to my feet, almost falling from having been weakened from the choking. Mr. Nolte stumbled backwards a few feet, his hands going to his gut. A blossoming red stain spread out across his dirty white button-up shirt and over his fingers. He looked up at me, the momentarily surprised expression on his face morphing back into an insane rage. I felt a sense of shock course through me. That would have put any ordinary person down. He let out a snarl and took another step towards me. With the space between us, though, I had a chance to lift the gun and aim properly. I didn't think, instead letting raw instinct take over me. I fired again. A large hole appeared just above his right eyebrow, and blood splattered the brick wall behind us. The force of the impact from the .45 round sent him flying backwards into a heap on the ground, and he lay still. For a split second, I simply stood there, in a sort of daze. Then I remembered my friend. Aubrey? I called in a panic, looking around and afraid that I'd see her lying dead on the ground. But then a fresh course of panic flew through me. Aubrey lay on her back on the ground, wrestling with someone, a girl about our age. I realized it was Nicole, one of Aubrey's best friends. The two girls rolled around, Aubrey dodging and ducking as sharp nails were swung at her face. Again letting instinct take over, I ran towards the pair of them. "Hey," I shouted at Nicole. The people in town might have been changed by the signal in the emergency broadcast, but they still had some normal mannerisms. Such as turning when being yelled at. I saw the look of fury lock onto me. Lashing out as hard as I could, I kicked her directly in the face. I'd put more power than I'd anticipated into it, as she rolled violently off of Aubrey, who scrambled away, trying to get the letter opener out of her pocket. But I was already over the girl, who looked up at me with blind fury. "I'm sorry, Nikki," I said quickly, then pulled the trigger. The shot slammed into her, and after a few twitches, she lay limp and still on the asphalt. Not giving another second, I turned to Aubrey. "You okay?" I asked quickly, reaching out to help her up. She didn't say anything, only nodded as she took my hand and got to her feet. "Look, we've got to get out of here." The others surely heard that, and we don't have enough ammo to deal with all of them. As the words tumbled out of my mouth, a part of me deep inside screamed at me that these weren't just thems, but people I'd known from day one of my life. A part of me was horrified that I had just killed two people, people I'd known and spoken with and laughed with. But I blocked it out. Giving into that emotion would collapse me to the ground, and dead in a matter of moments. Already, I could faintly hear the stomping of many feet from the main road approaching where we stood. I turned and gave Mr. Nolte's body a split-second look over. The ring of keys clipped to his belt glinted in the sunlight, and I quickly reached down and snatched them off the loop. Snatching up the paper cutter blade, we turned and ran for the alley. We reached it just in time as well. What I can only describe as half the fucking town swarmed into the diner's parking lot, smashing all the car windows and destroying everything in their path in order to try and find us. As we watched, we saw some of them turn and begin slicing at each other. I saw Mrs. Delaney, our old biology teacher, jam a screwdriver into the neck of Carrie Shawcross, a high school dropout who had made his living selling the teens of town pot. "They're beginning to turn on each other," Aubrey whispered in my ear. I had to agree. Whatever the signal did to them, it must be starting to break down their minds. Still feeling slightly numbed from the shooting, I motioned for Aubrey to follow me. Together, we turned away from the carnage unfolding across the street and quickly moved back to the residential side of town. It was a lot easier going, where so many of the affected were behind us. As we drew close to Aubrey's house, a thought passed through me, and I stopped. After noticing that I wasn't with her anymore, she turned back to me. "What is it?" she asked. I took a deep breath, feeling a slight tremor begin in my hands. The adrenaline from the attack was fading away, and reality was beginning to settle back in. But still, the thought persisted. "I need to go to my house," I said, A look of confusion fell over her face. What? Why? I took another deep breath, trying to compose myself. Before we try and leave, I have to. My voice choked off, and I swallowed, willing it to not quake with emotion. I have to get the photo in the living room. Of me and my parents. I want something to remember them by. Understanding suddenly filled her features. She looked around for a second, as if assessing how dangerous it might be. If you want, you can just go back to your house and wait for me, I continued. I don't mind going alone. But I have to do this. She shook her head, seeming surprised at my words. Eddie, don't you remember what you said to me the other day? We are not splitting up, no matter what. I almost burst into tears at her words. Knowing I wasn't alone in this made everything a tiny bit easier to take. I nodded gratefully. Let's go get it, but we need to be quick, she added, and again, I nodded. It took about 5 more minutes to make it from where we were to my backyard, but finally, we stepped through the gated entrance to my backyard. I looked around, feeling like I was on an alien planet as I stared around at the place I had grown up playing in as a kid, what once seemed so normal. Not wanting to delay, though, I reached out, and pulling my house keys from my pocket, unlocked the door. It opened with the same soft creak it always had, and we both quickly stepped inside and shut the door. Leading the way through the kitchen, I stepped into the hallway connecting it to the front rooms. The house was silent as a tomb, both in a metaphorical sense and literal. I gripped the paper cutter arm tightly as the front door appeared. It stood slightly open, swinging back and forth in the slight breeze from outside. Taking a deep breath, I turned away from it to the doorway which led into the living room. I suddenly dropped the blade, it falling to the wooden floor with a clatter. The world contracted in my vision, and I felt as though I were experiencing tunnel vision. I couldn't see left or right, only straight ahead. Behind me, I vaguely heard Aubrey ask me something, then gasp in horror. But I didn't answer her. I honestly couldn't. All I could do was walk slightly into the room, my eyes trained on the sight before me. A pair of legs stuck out from behind our couch, the tacky one that my mother had insisted on us buying 4 years ago. The couch was covered with red stains, ones that continued over the top and splashed against the wall behind it, smearing downward and out of sight. Khaki work pants, now stained with blood, were tucked into the tan work boots on the feet. The same boots I'd bought as a Christmas present last year. I still remember the pure joy I was filled with when the wrapping had been torn off and a sentiment about how thoughtful it had been stated. I stared at the legs of my father for what felt like an eternity, not being able to move. Not being able to feel anything except emptiness. Then I felt a hand on my shoulder. I turned to find Aubrey staring at me, tears falling from her eyes. She pulled me into a hug, and for a few seconds, we simply stood like that in the middle of the living room. Finally, she pulled back. She didn't say anything, only nodding at me before stepping back. For that, I was thankful. No words would be able to help right now. Feeling my vision clear, I focused instead on the task at hand. Forcing myself not to look at the crumpled form of my father, I saw the photo I'd come for sitting on the coffee table next to my father's Lizzie boy. It was one we'd taken when we'd gone to the Grand Canyon. The three of us posed with big smiles as we'd waited for the stranger we'd asked to help to take our picture. It was the memory of them I wanted to remember. Not this. Crossing to it, I picked it up, then slid open the back of the frame and pulled the photograph from it. Giving it one last look, I folded it and slid it into my pocket. I turned around, and found we were no longer alone in the house anymore. Aubrey had been too focused on me to notice the figure stepping in through the open front door. But on my gaze, she turned around, then rapidly backed up towards me, until she stood next to me. The figure stepped into the living room. The platinum blonde hair was now, somehow, even dirtier and more covered with blood than it had yesterday. Blood-filled eyes flickered between the two of us as the hand holding the knife twitched involuntarily. I heard Aubrey let out a gasp. Mom took another step towards us. I felt my heart began to slam against my chest, tears forming at the corner of my eyes. No, please, no, not this. Please don't make me do this. I had, in the heat of the moment, been able to kill the other two in order to keep Aubrey and me alive. But, now, being faced with the person who had literally brought me into this world, I didn't feel, even to save my life, like I could pull the trigger. It didn't matter if she was changed or not. That's when she froze. For a moment, I stood confused and, honestly, terrified. Then she began to twitch, first gently, then violently. It was almost as if she were waging a war inside herself. That was when she spoke. It wasn't the voice I remembered, this seemed forced, as if it were taking a great effort to do. Run, Edward, run. I felt my blood run cold at the words spoken. She's still in there, Oh, God, no. I felt frozen to the spot, even as Aubrey began tugging on my arm, trying to pull me away. An explosion of movement suddenly came from her. She turned and leapt through the living room window. The glass shattered, the sound almost painful inside the house. For a split second, I saw my mother stand up from where she crouched on the front lawn. Cuts on her face from the glass had started to bleed profusely. She looked back towards us, and for a split second, I swear I saw a tear form on her cheek. Then she ran, heading back to the street and screaming. It sounded like a mixture of the insane rage I'd heard the affected make, with the soul-tearing anguish and heartbreak. Aubrey gripped my arm as we stared out the broken window. For a long time, neither of us spoke. Tears fell from my eyes freely, and my mind seemed to lock. Finally, she spoke. Why didn't she kill us? It took me a minute to answer her. I don't know, I finally answered her quietly. Maybe whatever happened is losing its effect. Maybe she just couldn't do it. I just don't know. I stared at the carpet, then felt her tug my arm gently. Come on, we need to go. We need to get ready to leave tonight. I took a deep breath, wiping the tears from my eyes. Then I looked at her and nodded. Together, with her gently guiding me, we left my house for the last time and made our way back to hers. When we returned, I set about keeping myself busy by making some last-minute checks to her gear. Aubrey went upstairs to grab some final things, and for a moment, I was left alone. As I waited for her to return, a sudden burst of static suddenly came from the open basement door behind me. It was the ham radio. I turned, and heard a voice speaking. But it was too far away to hear properly. Aubrey, the radio. I called out. She came scrambling downstairs, holding onto a few items which she dropped next to our packs. Together, we stampeded for the basement door, nearly falling over ourselves as we got downstairs. As we reached the bottom, though, I saw her freeze solid on the second to last step. Aubrey, what is it? I asked her, worried. Then froze myself as I heard it. Aubrey? Honey, are you there? The voice was one I recognized. It belonged to Aubrey's father. But it wasn't coming from anywhere upstairs. It was coming from the ham radio. It crackled again. Aubrey, sweetheart, I know you're in the house. If you can hear me, please respond. She turned and looked up at me, a look of shock melting away into relief. Thank God, they're okay. She squealed. I felt a small pit form in my stomach as I thought about my parents, but I also felt genuine relief wash over me. I'm glad someone who lived here was spared this hell. Plus, if they're still outside of town, they may be able to help us. We may not have to hike out of here. Answer it, I urged, and together, we ran to the radio set. Aubrey slammed down on the transmit button. Daddy, I'm here, she cried into the microphone. Mr. Carmody's voice answered immediately. Oh, thank God. I didn't know if you'd have the radio set on. But I know my little girl. I told your mother that she'd remember the emergency procedures we taught you. That's a strange way to put things, I thought, but pushed the thought away. Everything normal felt strange right now. Aubrey hit the button again. Yes, I remembered. Oh, Daddy, you wouldn't believe what's happened here. It's horrible. People are killing each other. Something happened when that broadcast test went off. There are people, I don't know who, blocking all of the exits. They've said that something will happen in less than 2.5 days. You have to help, please. For a moment, there was silence, and I wondered if the people we'd heard on the radio had heard the radio signal and jammed it. Then her father's voice came again. Honey, I need you to listen carefully. I need to ask you a question. Are you alone? I saw Aubrey stand up straight in reaction to the question. A look of confusion passed over her face. It was one I know I mirrored. I felt a strange emotion settle over me, but I couldn't place it. Still, Aubrey leaned down and tapped the microphone. No, I'm not. Eddie's with me. We've helped each other survive the last few days. She continued to hold down the transmit button, then finished speaking. Why? There was silence again for a few moments, and then I heard Mr. Carmody sigh. Then he spoke, his voice suddenly flat and almost emotionless. I was afraid of it, he said simply. Aubrey's brow furrowed, and she and I exchanged a look. She spoke again into the mic. Daddy, why did you just say that? Silence again. Then the same flat tone. Sweetheart, you need to listen to me carefully. This may be difficult for you to do, but you have to leave him. Shock passed over both our faces. Daddy, what the hell are you talking about? She demanded. But my mind was already beginning to piece together something in my mind. Something I didn't want to think about. But as the jigsaw pieces came together, It made too much sense. The radio crackled again. "Aubrey, do you remember when I said that I couldn't talk about my work?" Another confused look shot through my friend's face. Inside my head, another piece fit into the puzzle. Aubrey's parents left town the morning everything happened. They were the only ones that left. Aubrey's father never told her what he did for a living. Aubrey's dad was scientist. I breathed out, feeling my insides begin to boil as the picture became clear. Aubrey turned towards me, then stabbed the microphone again. "Daddy, that makes no sense as to what?" She suddenly trailed off. I saw the look of realization pass over her face. First of shock, then horror. And then, finally, anger. She hit the transmit button so hard, I thought it would break. "Are you a part of the people who caused this?" she demanded, her voice rising to almost a yell of rage. Mr. Carmody answered immediately. "Sweetheart, I know you'll never understand, but we have to do things. Horrible things. Create horrible things, in order to keep this country safe. If we don't make them, others will. And they'll use it on us. That is what my job is. To create things before others do. It may sound terrible, I know, but you'll understand when you get older. It's why your mother and I devoted our lives to this cause." My rage began to boil over, and I lost control of my emotions. I sprinted forward, pushing Aubrey out of the way and stabbing the transmit button. "You motherfucker!" I screamed, "You just killed over 1,000 fucking people. Turned half of them into killing machines. Men, women, fucking children. My parents. All for a fucking experimental weapons test? You piece of shit, you're both fucking evil." I let go of the button. Mr. Carmody's voice answered immediately, this time cold. "Callous. It's for the greater good, son. You may never understand it, but some sacrifices have to be made. The few have to suffer and die in order to keep many safe. That's the price we pay." He spoke again, this time to Aubrey. "Aubrey, you have to do one of two things right now. You have to either leave Eddie behind, or kill him. You are the only one allowed to leave town alive. Nobody else can. It's too much of a security risk." For a minute, both of us just stood there, staring at each other. I felt my shoulders hunch. All the anger and fight flowed out of me. I felt a terrible emotion fall on me, replacing the anger. Hopelessness. I'm not getting out of here alive. Finally, I spoke. "Go." She twisted towards me, her face still a mask of confusion and anger. "What?" she breathed. I motioned, leaning back into the cold concrete wall. "We're not both making it out of here." I motioned to the radio. "You heard. They'll never let anyone else but you leave alive." I shook my head. "I'm not going to condemn you to die here as well. You're my friend. I care about you. I don't want to see you die as well. Just, go. And please, don't forget about me, okay?" I felt fresh tears fall from my eyes. Accepting you're going to die is something that people always say is never easy. I had planned out my life, going to college, having a family, living a long life. And now, it had been taken away from me as if I'd been told I'd had a terminal illness. But I couldn't be so selfish as to want to have the only person I cared about left alive, to die with me. I looked up, to see a look of shock on Aubrey's face. Tears were falling from her cheeks. Then they stopped. Her face hardened. Without saying a word to me, she crossed to the radio and hit the transmit button. "No." I felt my jaw drop open. "What?" Mr. Carmody's voice answered immediately. "Aubrey, you don't have a choice. Do as I say." She hit the button again. "Go to hell, Dad. I'm not leaving him." The radio crackled again, but this time, it wasn't her father that spoke. It was the deep voice of the man in charge, who we'd heard the last 2 days. "This is General Brighton. Young lady, I am giving you one final chance. You are ordered to either leave your companion behind, or you will die along with the rest of the town. You have 30 seconds to choose." Despite the mixed emotions in me, I felt a chill roll through me at his words. "Aubrey," I began, but she cut me off, raising a hand to silence me as she hit the transmit button. "General, with all due disrespect." "Fuck you, sir." The radio was silent for a minute. Then the general spoke again. "So be it. Sergeant Deacons, scramble all frequencies remaining on the airwaves, and station double the number of sentries at all known exits. Move up the final phase to T-11 hours. Anyone, and I mean anyone, approaches, you kill them. Am I clear?" The other voice spoke up. "Roger that, sir." Initializing scrambling in 20 seconds. There was a burst of static, and then Aubrey's father spoke again, this time softly. "I'm sorry, Aubrey. I wish you'd understood." His voice trailed off, but didn't come again. A sharp burst of static made me clap my hands over my ears, and then the radio went silent. Dead. Aubrey turned to me, her face set in a determined anger. Before I could say anything, she spoke. "I'm not leaving you, Eddie. We're going to make it out of here together, or die trying. We're going to get to the mine shaft. And if we get out of here," I cut her off. When she nodded. "When we get out of here, we're going to find a way to make them pay." She began to march upstairs. "Get everything ready. We're leaving tonight once it gets dark." That's where we are now. I'm sitting next to the back door, typing this out. I'm not sure if the jammer will have stopped even a satellite uplink by now, but it seems like it's working. So, I'm going to post this, and then wait. Once it gets truly dark, we're going to make a break for the top of town. We're going to find a way into the woods where they can't see us. We're going to make our way up to the mine shaft, using the branch method one of you suggested to erase our tracks. And we're going to escape this nightmare, once and for all. I'm not going to ask you for any advice this time. You've helped us survive to now, and I'll never be able to thank you enough for that. You're a huge reason why we're still alive. But now, this part we have to do on our own. Hopefully, when I write tomorrow, it'll be from somewhere far away from here. But, if you don't hear from me, it means we didn't make it. And, if we don't, thank you, anyways." Aubrey's motioning for me to get ready. "Wish us luck. The emergency broadcast test did something to the people in my town. We made it out. Final. We made it." Even as I type these words out, I can't fully believe them myself. I keep looking around at all of the people, normal people, who are all talking and laughing with each other, afraid beyond belief that I'll blink my eyes and find myself back in town, like the director's cut of The Descent. But I know it's real. We escaped. Both of us. But there were several moments during the night that I thought we wouldn't. Before I tell you what happened, I just need to say one thing, and it's something that Aubrey also asked me to tell you all. Thank you. When we first rounded that corner and saw Mr. Schultz murder Mrs. Kravitz a few days ago, neither one of us knew what to do, beyond simply trying to survive. But thanks to you all, we always had some idea of a plan to follow, some ideas to keep in mind. We wouldn't be here right now if it wasn't for you, and neither of us will ever forget that. That being said, it's time I told you about how we made our escape. And what happened as we did. After I finished posting my account of what happened yesterday, Aubrey motioned for me to join her at the back door. Looking out, I saw the last remnants of the sun sinking in the sky, casting an almost eerie reddish glow over the town. As I watched darkness fall, a somber thought passed through my mind. This may be the last time the sun ever sets on this place. Aubrey's voice snapped me back to reality. "It's almost time, Eddie. We're going to give it another 15 minutes or so, and then we're going." She turned to me, her face still set in the determined look that she'd worn when marching out of the basement. But her eyes betrayed the mixture of fear and doubt that lurked behind the brave face. I nodded at her. The two of us had agreed to not head straight for the bottom of the ski lifts, as the sentries the general had spoken about would no doubt be watching it. The last thing we needed was to be picked off by a sniper halfway up to the mine. "You really think we're gonna make it?" she asked, allowing a bit of vulnerability to break through her facade. It was my turn to put on a brave face. "We're gonna give it a damn good try, that's all I know." She nodded, then looked out the window again. "I can't believe this place will be gone tomorrow. All this," she gestured out at the roofs of houses and the town beyond, "all we've known our entire lives. After tomorrow, it'll be like it never existed." The thought was almost too much to bear, but I pushed it away. "We can't think about that right now," I said. "We need to focus on surviving. On getting to that mine shaft without being spotted. That's all that matters now." A look of gratitude passed over her face, and she quickly pulled me into a short hug before stepping back. "Thank you," she said simply. I allowed the corner of my mouth to lift in a smile and nodded. We both turned away from the door for our packs as the watch on Aubrey's wrist let out a soft beep. It was time. Slipping out the back door into the night, we carefully made our way to the edge of the backyard. A large, white picket gate in the tall hedges opened up onto an alley that ran between this group of houses. Being as quiet as possible, I reached out and pulled the latch up, slowly swinging the gate open. The yellow glow of a street light illuminated the alley, which for the time being seemed to be deserted. I turned and signaled to Aubrey that it was safe, and as we had the last few days, we used the yards of the houses as cover, this time moving up towards the very edge of town itself. Thankfully, it seemed that the affected, however many of them were left now, had all moved into the downtown area. The neighborhood seemed deserted, Save for the ever-present stench of death that had seemed to stain town the last few days, and the occasional scenes of slaughter we passed. I glanced into the lit-up front window of one of the houses as we passed by it. I had to quickly look away. The grisly scene of a man who'd been impaled to the far wall by a fire poker through the mouth was another image that would likely forever haunt my dreams. Assuming we survive. I shook my head. We are going to make it out, and whether it takes a month, a year, or a decade, these bastards will pay for what they've done. The thought brought back the image of my mother, wrestling with herself and throwing herself through the window to keep from harming us. I allowed the anger that boiled up inside of me to fuel my determination, and we moved to the second to last row of houses. The streetlights beaming down from the main roads meant that we could still navigate without having to use our flashlights, a blessing, for I felt sure that the beams would attract unwanted attention from either group we wanted to stay hidden from. The sound of screeching tires nearly caused us both to jump. "Hide," I hissed to Aubrey. But she was already in motion, dashing into the backyard of a house and flattening herself on the ground, using a tall row of hedges as cover. I hit the deck next to her, feeling my heart thudding loudly in my chest. A few moments later, the roar of an engine could be heard, and not 2 seconds afterward, the sheriff's Explorer flew by, almost leaving the road with how fast it was going. I didn't catch a glimpse of Sheriff Wake, the interior of the cruiser was too dark to see into. But I was able to see the grisly sight that adorned the hood. Oh, Jesus! A body had been mounted to the hood of the Explorer, tied down with what looked like rope or chains. It was like some sick, demented caricature of a hunter, driving down from the woods with a prized buck on the hood. Thankfully, though, I couldn't tell who the body was. The cruiser continued on, and I waited to hear the screech of tires as it turned onto the last paved road in town. But I didn't. Instead, I heard another roar of the engine, followed by the smashing sounds of metal. For a moment, my mind couldn't make sense of the noise. Then Aubrey whispered beside me, "Eddie, he's going up the mountain." The realization crashed into me like a tsunami. There was a utility road, barely a single, bumpy dirt path that led up directly under the ski lifts. The sheriff was going straight towards the waiting sentries. This was our chance to use this unexpected diversion as cover. "Come on, let's make a break for the woods. This is our chance," I loudly whispered to her. Her eyes wide with understanding, she nodded. Together, we leapt up from our hiding place and ran. Every step we took, I was sure I'd hear a cry of rage from one of the affected, or the piercing sound of a shot ring out from the dark. But nothing happened as we fled across the last row of houses, across the street, and aimed for the thick tree line that marked the border of town. A few moments later, we entered the dark sanctuary of the woods. We stopped to catch our breath for a second, then slowly unhooked our flashlights from our packs. "Keep your light hooded, and try and move as slow and quietly as you can," I whispered. She nodded. For what seemed like forever, but what the glow in the dark hands of my watch told me was only an hour and a half, we walked. Even though we were moving away from the horror behind us, I still felt tense, afraid we'd be attacked at any moment. The ground began to slope upwards, indicating that we were starting our ascent up the mountain. A few minutes later, we stopped as multiple sounds pierced the still night air. The echo distorted the sounds somewhat, and it took a second to recognize them. It was the rattle of automatic gunfire, and from what I could hear, it sounded like a lot of it. Sounds like the sheriff found the sentry guards, I thought. I could tell that Aubrey had the same thought, a cautious look was embedded on her face. For a few seconds more, the gunfire continued. Then, it stopped. Silence, albeit now with a slightly airy feel to it, settled again over the woods. "Do you think they killed him?" Aubrey finally whispered, the first thing she'd uttered since we'd entered the woods. I shook my head. "I really don't know," I admitted. I looked at my watch. It showed that it was close to 11 p.m. now. The real dead of night was coming fast. I motioned for her to keep going. "Come on." Again, we moved in silence, only unhooding our flashlights to navigate our way around fallen trees and bushes. As the slope became steeper, I realized that I hadn't heard a single animal call. No owls, no birds, no bears or coyotes or mountain lions. They're all gone. They know this is a dead place now, and they did the smart thing and got out of Dodge while they still could. Shaking my head, I kept walking. After another 20 minutes, I came to a break in the tree line. "What is it?" Aubrey asked, stepping beside me as I shone my flashlight at the ground. Well-worn tire tracks could be seen in the muddy corridor that swung up the hill towards a darkened shape. "It's a house," I said quietly, then realized whose house it was. "Aubrey, it's the Knowles house." She looked at me for a second, her face blank, before her eyes widened in recognition. "The Preppers. The ones whose keys you grabbed from. She trailed off, remembering our near-death experience from earlier. I nodded. Yes. That'll mean they might have some stuff we can add to our survival gear. Maybe even another gun. I looked up at the dark shape again. Plus, it'll give us a chance to rest for a few minutes and check the map again. She gave the house a pensive look, then nodded at me. Moving as the crow flies, we moved straight up the hill until we stood at its base. Part of the house had been constructed on stilts, sticking out from the mountain a bit. A set of wooden steps led up to a large deck area. Even though I was sure that nobody was here, I still pulled the pistol from my waistband and flicked the safety off. Right now, it pays to be cautious. Leading the way up the stairs slowly, I found the deck had a perfect view back down into town. I only allowed my gaze to wash over the lit-up houses and buildings for a moment. I saw that someone, either one of the affected or someone else, had started a large fire near the edge of the downtown area. The flames rose high into the sky, the orange and red glow shimmering in the dark. Turning away, I pulled the ring of keys from my belt. The third key fit into the door, and with a soft creak, swung open to reveal a dark hallway. Moving inside, I shut the door behind us and locked it again. Unhooding our flashlights, we set down our packs and quickly checked out the house. We didn't dare turn the lights on, the sentries would no doubt see it if we did. Nobody's home. I heard Aubrey call from a room over. Sighing in relief, I slid the pistol back into my waistband and turned to pull the map out of the backpack. Pushing aside cans of spray paint and tools that had been placed on a workbench, I spread the map out, focusing the beam of the light on the side of the mountain. The Nolte's house wasn't on the map itself, but I had a rough idea of where it was. I traced my finger up to where the sign marking the mine shaft was. "Aubrey, we're less than a mile and a half from the mine." I called out to her. I heard her race back into the room. "That's great. It means we've made more than halfway up the mountain." A trace of excitement entered her voice. "And look what I found hanging over the bed in the back room." I turned around, aiming my flashlight to see what she held up. For a moment, I blinked to make sure I was seeing things correctly. I felt my eyes widen, and I let out an astonished half-laugh. "Holy shit, dude." In Aubrey's left hand, she held a box of what the label stated were 12-gauge shotgun shells. But it was the hulking shape she balanced in her right hand that caught my attention. I looked at it, my gaze shifting from the metal folding stock to the imposing barrel. "That's a freaking SPAS 12," I breathed out. A military shotgun from the 80s. The Noltes must have paid a pretty penny for it. She placed the shotgun and the shells on the table. "I figure our odds of survival just went up a few notches," she stated, smiling slightly. I couldn't help but smile as well. The shotgun did drastically increase our chances of making it to the mine shaft. Even if we ran into a sentry or two, we'd been on a much more level playing field than with just the pistol. "Well, now that we have two guns, here," I said, pulling the pistol from my waistband again and holding it out to her. She looked apprehensively at it for a moment, then took it, along with the 2 extra magazines I gave her. "I haven't shot a gun in years," she admitted to me. "Well, hopefully we don't need to it." "Either of these," I replied, "but it's better to be safe." She nodded, then looked at the map as I opened the box of shells. I counted at least 24 shells in the box. Checking the gun, I found it to be unloaded, and began sliding shells into the breech. After 8 shells, it refused to take any more. I placed the box of remaining shells into my pack, then turned to Aubrey. "Well, you ready?" I asked her. She turned to me and nodded, and we picked up our packs, slinging them on. That was when a loud sound came from outside, from farther up the mountain. "What the hell?" Snatching up the shotgun, I flicked both safeties off. "Kill your light," I said to Aubrey. A moment later, we became enshrouded in darkness. The sound came again, accompanied by a crashing sound. Moving to the large window which looked out of the back of the house and up the mountain, I swung my gaze around. A blinding flash of light made me squeeze my eyes shut. Opening them again, I suddenly saw what was flying towards us. A surge of adrenaline and horror flooded every fiber of my being. "Oh, fuck me," sideways. I turned and sprinted back into the room we'd been in, snatching Aubrey's arm as she'd been coming to stand next to me. "Move!" I screamed. The world around us seemed to explode. The sound of exploding glass, tearing wood and screeching metal sounded about what I thought the end of the world must be like. I felt the house beneath my feet shake, and for a moment the bright lights flashed over us, the roar of an engine almost deafening. Another ear-piercing crash came from the front of the house, along with sounds of something heavy crashing to earth. Then silence. For a few moments, we simply stood there. I could feel Aubrey shaking slightly in my grasp. Then we stepped out of the room. The entire right side of the Nolte's house was gone. In its place was a massive hole that opened up to the night sky. "Wah, what the hell was that?" Aubrey asked, her voice shaking. I turned to look out of the hole on the other side of the house, but couldn't see anything. The house shook again slightly, now made unsteady from the destruction. "Come on, we need to get out of here," I insisted, pulling on her arm. Unlocking the back door, we stepped out onto a rocky area. I felt sure of what I'd seen flying straight at me like a missile, but I needed to be sure. Glancing around and holding the shotgun in unsteady hands, I moved so I could see down the hill. I freaking knew it. Resting about 400 or 500 feet down against a tree, was the sheriff's Ford Explorer. It lay on its side, completely destroyed from its flight through the house and down the hill. The headlights cast bright white beams into the woods, and smoke had begun billowing up from underneath the hood. Aubrey stepped next to me and looked down, then back up at me. Was he in it?" she asked me. I wanted to lie to her, to tell her I was sure he had been. But the truth was, I didn't know. So, I answered honestly. "I honestly hope so." She looked around. "But, didn't we hear him fighting with the sentries? They should have killed him." I just stared down at the destroyed cruiser. An almost animalistic wariness and fear had settled over me, and I turned and looked around at the almost pitch-black tree line about 20 feet away from us. He could have jumped out. He could be waiting for us. I forced myself to breathe slowly, feeling a little more reassured by the heft of the shotgun in my hands. Even if he had done that, he likely would have lost his rifle. And one blast from this will put him down for sure. I finally spoke. "We can't stop to think about that now. If those sentries are anywhere near us, they'll have heard the crash. We need to keep moving and get out of here before we're spotted." Aubrey looked at me, her eyes hardening instantly, and nodded. I said a silent prayer of thanks for how tough my friend was. We both needed to be to make it the final bit out. "Come on," then she said, and began moving towards the trees. I followed close behind, and still feeling the uneasy feeling in my gut, we moved into the next set of trees. We continued upwards for another half an hour. I saw no trace of anyone, but I refused to let my guard down. I kept my grip on the shotgun, aiming it around almost every tree we passed. I was thankful that we had chosen to put on the heavier coats and hiking boots. The air was becoming chilly the farther we went up. At one point, a branch snapped somewhere off to our right, and we both stopped, aiming our guns in the direction of the noise. After a minute of nothing appearing, though, we continued on. The trees became more spaced out, less clumped together, and I realized we were close to the mine shaft. I'd seen photos of the entrance in the town's visitor center, and knew we'd have an open space of 500 or 600 feet to run before reaching it. And then, it appeared in the gloom. I could see the cavernous rectangular opening, looking like the yawning mouth of a monster and somehow even darker than everything around it. I could also see several small buildings around it, as well as a decaying conveyor belt feeding out from the entrance. I took a deep breath, hearing my exhalation shake slightly. It was both from fear and exhilaration. The latter, because we were so close now to actually escaping. The former, because I felt terrified that this was where we'd be cut down, by anyone or anything. The thought of dying so close to freedom was almost unbearable, and I forced the mental image of my own broken body lying in front of the entrance away. "Okay, when I count down from 3, we don't stop. We don't hesitate. We don't think. We just run like hell for the entrance, okay?" Aubrey looked at me, the same mixture of fear and astonished excitement in her eyes. "Okay. I'm ready," she said. I raised 3 fingers. Then lowered one. My heart began to beat like a drum in my chest. I lowered the second. My breathing became harsh and ragged. I lowered the final finger. We ran. The wind whipped in our ears, and the cold stung my eyes so badly that I felt tears beginning to form. But still, I ran, hearing our footfalls echoing back at us from the surrounding rocky terrain. I snapped my gaze around, and for a second, I thought I saw a dark figure rushing towards me. Horror flooded my body. "Fuck, no," I mentally screaming, raising the shotgun to fire. But nothing attacked me. I was simply seeing things in my panicked dash. The darkened buildings flashed by. And then, we were inside the shaft. The two of us stopped, our heavy breathing amplified and echoing back at us from farther inside. We stayed there for a few minutes, allowing ourselves to regain our composure. Finally, Aubrey stood up, using her free hand to push her brown hair away from her eyes. "We made it," she whispered quietly. I felt a small smile form on my lips. "We did. We made it here," I echoed. Then took a deep breath. "Now we just need to make it through." I saw some of Aubrey's happiness deflate, but she nodded, agreeing with my statement. "You're right, let's save the celebrations for when we get out the other side," she motioned to me. "Break out the map, that way we can find out where to go." Pulling off my pack and setting down the shotgun, I fetched the map of the mine out of the pocket and unfolded it. Aubrey snapped on her light, and together, we studied it. "Okay, it looks like the main shaft goes in about 2 or 3 miles or so, before branching off into the side shaft that'll take us out the other side of the mountain. We just need to remember to look for the sign, if it's still up, marking it," she said, tracing her finger over the worn paper. I nodded, following the path she'd outlined and mentally locking it into my head. Folding the map up again, I glanced at my watch. 10 to midnight now. That's when Aubrey's voice snapped me from my thoughts. It was filled with a sudden, tense tone to it that I stiffened like a board. Eddie?" she managed out. I turned to look at her, to see what had suddenly set her so on edge. She was aiming her flashlight at the ground, and my gaze followed the beam of light down. "Oh, shit." Clearly visible on the rocky floor of the shaft entrance was a large, red smear of blood. Beside it lay a few shell casings from a rifle or a pistol, evidence of a shooting and a struggle that hadn't ended well for someone. The smear of blood showed it went deeper into the mine. "Oh, fuck, no," I breathed out, swallowing hard. I didn't want to say the thought that was now endlessly repeating itself over and over in my mind. But I didn't have to. Aubrey said it for me. "He's in here, Eddie. He's in here with us." She didn't need to clarify, I knew exactly who the he was she was referring to. The pitch blackness of the shaft had suddenly taken on a very sinister and terrifying atmosphere, and my eyes squinted into the dark, trying to separate rock and wood from a human outline. "What do we do?" she asked me, now holding my arm with her free hand. With the other, she was aiming the pistol out into the black. I already knew the answer to that. So did she, as much as neither of us wanted to admit it. The shaft was our only way out of here, our only sure way of surviving. Going back down into town would be a death sentence, and going over the mountain itself opened us up to being spotted by sentry or satellite. Swallowing again, I shouldered my pack and picked the shotgun up, now holding it in slightly sweaty hands. "Don't let your guard down, even for a second," I whispered tensely to her. "Keep your light hooded, keep as quiet as possible, and don't stop moving. And most importantly, stay close to me." Her eyes showed how terrified she was. But still, she nodded, then flicked on the flashlight. Stepping slightly in front of her, we slowly but steadily began our walk into the mine shaft. We stayed close enough that our shoulders brushed against each other, and I could hear her breathing coming into short, ragged gasps as mine. The only other sounds we could hear were the soft, ghostly whistle of wind through the shaft, along with the dripping of water somewhere farther inside. That made it worse, because it meant that the sheriff could be silently standing in the black, waiting for us to get close enough to do whatever his fried, insane mind had in store for us. The seconds felt like minutes, and the minutes felt like hours as we moved deeper and deeper into the shaft and into the mountain itself. The air became even colder than before, and even with the heavy coat protecting me, I felt myself begin to shiver slightly. The shaft angled upwards for a moment, then began heading down in a gradual slope. We passed by mine carts and more conveyor belts, along with a row of pickaxes. With a pang of anxiety, I realized that one was missing from its place. Hopefully to God it's just because some miner didn't bother to put his back, and not that someone recently grabbed it. Here and there, a few large, open spaces where a vein of whatever precious metal had been discovered had been concentrated on. Every inch of my body was now tense, and I forced myself to ease my pressure on the shotgun's trigger, afraid I'd accidentally fire a shot. I didn't want to accidentally cause a cave-in. There was no telling how unstable the shaft had become in the decades of disuse. That was when we saw the flickering light ahead. I felt Aubrey stop dead beside me, and she quickly flicked off her light. For a few moments, we stood there in the dark, waiting. When nothing rushed towards us, we spared a look at each other, then slowly moved forwards. I could see her aiming the pistol at every nook and cranny that came in her vision. I didn't blame her one bit. About 100 feet more, and we found ourselves at the edge of the largest cavern we'd come across yet. It looked to be a central connecting hub for the mine shaft. I could see at least 4 or 5 smaller shafts leading off of it. I realized that this was the area that the shaft we needed to find branched off from. Aubrey suddenly gripped my shoulder, tight enough to cause pain. Her breath became ragged again, and I followed her gaze into the cavern. Oh, God Almighty! There had been sentries guarding the entrance to the mine shaft. At least 3 or 4 of them. I know, because they were all here. And they were all very, very dead. They'd been dragged back here and, the only way I can describe it is had sickening things done to them. One had been impaled onto a stalagmite rising up from the cavern floor, while a second lay half in and half out of a mining cart. A third had been pinned to the wall with the pickaxe I'd spotted missing from the line a few minutes ago. But the fourth one was the worst. He lay slumped against wooden support beam. His freaking head had been torn off his shoulders. In place of it, a rusty shovel had been jammed into the body. A flickering flashlight lay beside his hand, the source of the light we'd seen. Feeling like I was going to be sick, I swallowed, then looked around. I saw no sign of movement. Aubrey finally spoke again, her voice barely a whisper. "Eddie, where is he?" The rage-filled roar behind us nearly stopped my heart, along with the thundering footfalls. I spun around, fear coursing through my body as I saw a blur of movement charging towards us. I began to raise the shotgun, but the blur crashed into me before I could fully get it up. My finger instinctively squeezed the trigger, and an almost deafening boom rang into my ears, along with a sudden flash of light from the barrel. Then I was crashing to the floor of the cavern. For a second, I fought to get the breath which had been driven from my lungs back. Then I began fumbling to free myself from the heavy pack, which now weighed me down on the ground like a turtle flipped onto its back. As I finally got my arms out of the straps, I heard Aubrey let out a blood-curdling scream. I snapped my gaze up, and felt my blood run cold. Whatever had been in the broadcast test that had been inflicted on my town had to have affected everyone differently. It must have driven some people far more insane than the others. And Sheriff Wake had been affected the worst by it. The figure that now glared at us almost didn't seem human anymore. Bullet holes riddled the man's thick, muscular chest from where he'd been shot by the sentries, all dripping blood out in rivulets. His fingers had almost been scraped down to the bone. I could see the white tips glinting in the flickering light. But it was face that was the most horrifying. It had been mutilated, likely by himself, to such a degree that it looked like a creature straight out of the Hellraiser series. He had no eyelids or lips, and his teeth were coated with blood. The blood-red eyes moved between me and Aubrey, as if sizing up which of us to attack first. I tore my gaze around the cavern, searching desperately for the shotgun I'd dropped. With a surge of adrenaline, I saw it lying about 20 feet away from me. That's when the eyes locked onto me. I saw the huge Bowie knife in his hand. I didn't think, I just ran. I dashed for the shotgun, seeing the figure explode into motion out of the corner of my eye. I stretched my arm out, the barrel getting closer and closer to my outstretched fingers. I screamed as I felt something slash at my back, a searing pain coursing through me. I fell to the ground, now less than 5 feet from the gun. Spinning around, I found the sheriff towering over me. The knife now dripped blood from the blade. My blood. I tried to scramble backwards, but he took a step forward and brought his foot down on my ankle. I screamed from the pain that shot through my leg, and I saw the look of sadistic fury cross his features. He raised the knife, and I closed my eyes, praying that Aubrey would escape and that I would have a quick death. The sound of gunshots rang out, and I opened my eyes to see the man stumble forwards. Looking behind him, I saw Aubrey moving into the room, aiming the pistol at him. She kept pulling the trigger until it clicked empty. The sheriff spun towards her, snarling with rage as she ejected the magazine and grabbed another. But he'd taken his weight off my foot. I was free. As he began to step towards her, I reached out. My fingers caught the barrel, and I snatched the shotgun up. Jumping to my feet, I saw Aubrey dodge the knife slash that had been aimed for her throat. She looked terrified, and I knew she wouldn't be able to dodge the next slash. "Hey!" I screamed, aiming the gun. The sheriff spun around, his eyes locking with mine. I pulled the trigger, the deafening boom rang out again. As soon as I knew my aim had been true, I turned away. I didn't want to see the man's head explode from the buckshot. But I heard his body fly back, crashing into something that let out a loud crack. I wasn't even able to take a second to breathe, when the rumbling began. The entire cavern began to shake violently, and I dropped the shotgun, almost falling on my hands and knees. I cast a look towards the still form of the sheriff. He'd crashed into one of the support beams when he'd flown backwards. The whole cavern is about to collapse. I looked at Aubrey and saw the same horrific realization filling her face. "Run!" she screamed, pointing at a shaft to my left. A shaft that had a sign marked exit painted in white letters. Sprinting to and snatching up my pack, we dashed for the shaft as boulders and dirt began to crash down from the ceiling. Dust and dirt filled my lungs as I ran. I saw Aubrey enter the side shaft and leapt in after her without a moment to spare. In seconds, the entire cavern had caved in. Behind us was an immovable wall of dirt and rock. We lay there for a few minutes, coughing softly and trying to catch our breath. "Are you okay?" I heard Aubrey ask in the dark. I let out another cough. Yeah, I'm okay." I felt tears sting my eyes as I realized how close to death I'd been. "Thanks," I added. I felt a hand fall on my shoulder. I was about to speak again, when I heard the muffled sound of someone yelling on the other side of the cave-in. We both froze. "Yes, sir. It looks like one of the subjects made it up into the mineshaft." A moment of silence. "No, sir. It looks like some of our men stopped him. But there was a cave-in. We lost our men as well as him." Another moment. "No, sir. I don't believe anyone else got through here. And with the cave-in, no one will be able to now. This exit is blocked." A final moment of silence. "Roger that, sir," withdrawing to a safe distance. "Over and out." And with that, the sound of the voice died away. We could faintly hear the sounds of retreating footsteps. Then silence. After a moment, we stood up. Neither of us said anything. We just began walking. When we emerged into the open air at the exit to the shaft, the fresh air felt better than I'd ever realized it had. The two of us looked at each other. "We made it, Eddie," Aubrey exclaimed, then flung herself into my arms. We laughed and cried, both in relief at having survived, and in sorrow for all that had been lost. Then she pulled back, still smiling. "Come on, let's get out of here," she said. Together, we'd made our way down the other side of the mountain as the night gave way to dawn. When we reached the road, we stuck out our thumbs until a passing 18-wheeler stopped to pick us up. Giving some story about being hikers who'd gotten lost, we hauled ourselves into the cab. As we accelerated away from the hell we'd experienced these last few days, I looked out at the sun, which now seemed to have a hopeful gaze to it. Deep inside myself, I felt the horror I'd experienced the last few days. I felt the grief welling up inside myself for all the people who had been turned into a science experiment, who likely would be dead soon, if they weren't already. I thought of my mother, but I pushed it away, focusing on the white clouds in the sky. There would be time for grieving later. There would be time for planning later. But, for now, it was simply time to enjoy still being alive. I felt Aubrey's hand close in mine, and I looked at her. She smiled at me, and I smiled back. We hitchhiked until we got out of the state. And we kept going. That's where I am now. I won't say where we are right now, but it's far enough away that I feel safe. Nobody knows we're alive. They all think we died with town. And that will keep us safe for now. I honestly don't know what they did to wipe it off the face of the earth. I can only imagine. But every attempt I've made to look up our town yields no results now. Not in Google. Not in Bing. Nowhere. It's completely gone. And now, we're going to disappear. Aubrey and me. We don't know where we'll go, but we're going to disappear for a long while. We're going to hide away, and we're going to plan. We're going to find a way to make the people who did those horrific things to our town pay. No matter what it takes. But for now, I'm just happy to be alive. But I have to give you one final warning. If you ever hear about another emergency broadcast test happening in the future, whether you live in a small town, or a big city, turn off your phones. Turn off your radios. Turn off your TVs. Because those people are still out there. They're still perfecting and honing that weapon they're making. And who knows where they'll end up testing it next.